Nuestro próximo panel, invito a Carlos Garibaldi a permanecer allí, ya quien va a ser el moderador, se llama Geopolítica y escenarios de negocios para el sector energético de América Latina y el Caribe. Invito entonces a subir al escenario a los señores Bob Fryklund, vicepresidente y jefe estratega del Upstream Energy Group de S&P Global Energy, al señor Jeremy Marin, vicepresidente de Energía y Sostenibilidad del Instituto de las Américas de Universidad de California, San Diego, y al señor Roberto Brandt, consultor internacional en energía y estrategias corporativas y miembro no residente del Centro de Estudios Energéticos del Baker Institute, Rice University. Modera este panel, como les comenté antes, el señor Carlos Garibaldi, secretario ejecutivo de ARPEL y miembro no residente del Instituto de las Américas, Universidad de California en San Diego. Dejo entonces la palabra al señor Carlos Garibaldi. Gracias.
Well, I thank for your patience of having to have me twice. We just heard Daniel Jurgen give us a geopolitics and energy panorama globally. And now, to set the stage for our discussion, I'm going to invite Bob Fryklund to give us a brief backdrop presentation about the effects on Latin America and the Caribbean. You'll be so kind.
Thank you, Carlos. It's always a pleasure. So I want to pick up the theme just a little bit about what you heard earlier about the remaking of the world. And I want you to think about three questions. Why now, and what is this, an opportunity for Latin America? Or is this another challenge? The second thing I want you to think about then is, as we go through the remaking of the world, so to speak, what does it mean for energy security, and particularly for Latin America? And the third thing that I want you to think about is this finally going to help change the system of socioeconomics in a way that we attack energy poverty? With that in mind, the first thing that you have to think of is, why now? Why is the world being remade now? Now, Carlos hinted a little bit of it. We're 80 years, a little over 80 years since the end of World War II. After World War II, what happened? The world got together and made a lot of institutions to try to prevent another world war. All of those institutions that begin with a W, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, World Health, were all put together. A little later, the United Nations was put in there. And then even later came the IEA. Now, all of those institutions have not really kept up with the time, in particularly, and the changes that have happened in the world. So those institutions have been losing their ability to be successful at their missions. So that's opened a window here where there are a couple of characters who also are on the stage right now to jump in here. All three of them are trying to get their legacy together. If you think about, one is Donald Trump, not a surprise, right? A gentleman who has a very large goal and aspiration, even wanting to be on a $250 bill now in the United States. We have President Xi from China, who wants to make sure that China's legacy is still there. And of course, we have Putin, who's trying to expand and really recreate, in some ways, the old Soviet Union. So those are the three actors that are out there, and they're expansionist, which is something that we haven't seen in many decades, right? It goes back to those colonial times. The catalyst of all this is interesting. The three of those folks didn't really get together and collude, did they? What's happened really that started the Middle Eastern war and started things going, besides that vacuum that we had, is really partially why we're here today, which is energy. We have an abundance of energy now. In fact, before the war, we had an overabundance of oil, refined products, an overabundance of natural gas and LNG. And that kind of made a little bit of a spot here where we could move forward quickly with some decisions about remaking the world. That set the stage then for where we are today, except for one thing, which was in October of 2024 when Hamas attacked Israel. That provided a catalyst for the Middle Eastern war to go forward and for things to start moving. Now, let's spend some time then thinking about what about Latin America. So the next phase of that, really, and if we dive into the United States and the Trump vision, some of you may have already looked at the national security briefing document that came out last year, but it very details goes through the actions and ideas of what's there for Mr. Trump. But for us in Latin America, and Caribbean, what is most important is the first time in decades the United States has started to focus more on the region. Now, you may have a different opinion of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but for once, there is a focus. And there are three tenets that are important for you to think about relative to that. The first one that's spelled out in there is part of the old Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine has been an addendum has been added here that really speaks to kind of make this region one that's free of drugs. So those were the first actions when you saw the U.S. attacking those boats and blowing them up. The second one was to change the leadership in some countries to be more democratic, particularly those that have gone into economic disaster. And that was Venezuela. Those were the first two acts. The third act that's on there, and this map shows you where China is throughout more or less, not really so much the Caribbean, but more or less through all of Latin America. And the bubbles on there show you whether it's an oil and gas, whether it's green, whether it's a mining concession, whether it's sitting in there as a refinery in orange, kind of that reddish orange ball, and then finally where the Belt and Road are. And you think about the money, even more importantly, that China has tied up here in the region, over $21 billion in Argentina here alone, almost 17 in Peru. So it's a massive amount of money. But one of the doctrines is that the United States, together with its allies, need to counter this. Now, I'm not saying one way or the other whether I agree with that or not, but I'm just laying out the doctrines here for you. So that's really the third tenet that the United States is operating under as Trump thinks about how to remake the world. So where do we take this then when we think about Latin America? Does Latin America, are you going to agree with this kind of model? Are you going to agree with the doctrine? Well, one thing that's happening, and we know that happens all the time in Latin America, is we pivot from left to right, don't we? And this is a year where there are 5 elections. Some have started down the road already. I look at some of my friends from Colombia. They had their first round of that just recently. But you can see on here, the left is a reddish color and blue is the more right. This is our model as we go forward for the future. And what we're predicting is that things will start to move a little bit back towards a market-friendly and a more sort of right-centric one. That will align to some degree then with the Trump doctrine and potentially with the United States. That's the thinking. Now, you may disagree with that, and we can talk about that here in a second. The other thing to think about then is oil and gas. What's the role? Well, oil and gas has always played a great role here in the region of doing what? It helps us with our socioeconomic background. It helps us work on poverty. It helps us work on bringing people really in the Forex exchange. So if you look at this chart that I put up here quickly, when you look at the stoplights on there, the countries like Brazil that are green, you can see the green is good when you look at it, and as you go to the brown, those are the countries that have the most trouble with it as we start to think about it. So you can see Venezuela on the bottom, even though it has a lot of oil and gas, one has to think about how can a country with the largest reserves supposedly in the world never have produced anything close to that, right? The Permian Basin is a 100 billion barrel basin, and it's producing 8 million barrels a day. Venezuela never even got to half of that in its history. Why? Are those resources really there? Good question we can talk about. But Venezuela, in a sense, is one that's sort of on the bottom. When we look at Brazil, Brazil is able to harness oil and gas, in particular oil, to move forward and to solve a lot of their socioeconomic programs, lifting people out of poverty. The other thing, though, that's there in other countries, you can see Guyana, right? Guyana's now moving very fastly in that direction. There'll be some others quickly, like Suriname. I have friends from Suriname are here today that have seen that happen. So when you think about what's deciding the elections, it's Forex exchange, it's inflation, it's crime, corruption, and one that's not on their labor. We'll get into that here again in a second. The other thing that's interesting, and it was brought up earlier, is how is Latin America reacting to this, right? So Latin America right now, if you think about it, the growth for oil for the next 5 years, and actually some would say 10, is coming out of Latin America. It's Guyana, it's Brazil, it's Vaca Muerta. Those are the three of the biggest right now. Suriname is coming in second. When we look at the response from the war so far, what has happened when we look at that, this chart shows you that 6.1 million barrels a day, think of that, 6.1 million barrels a day, it was shipped out of Latin America to the rest of the world to help with the problem right now. That's a massive 35% increase. If you look at that blue line on here, it shows you how much on a year-to-year basis we used to ship out of here. It's a huge amount. So Brazil in particular, but Guyana and also here in Argentina have risen to this occasion to try to help the world out. How long will that continue? Well, right now it looks like for the next 10 years, but energy security. When we start to think about energy security for the region, we've always thought about trade security and trading, haven't we? There's 5 different trading blocks in the region. Think about those. Maybe we'll talk about a couple of those in a minute here, but I suggest that many of you probably don't even know the 5 of them. But the biggest one of all is what? Is Mercosur, and this is what the map shows you on here. How effective have they been? Now, this last year, there was an agreement set between the EU and Mercosur. Now, it's not signed yet. It's still in the negotiation phase. Could that trading bloc and the others be used in order to form a basis for a better connected, better energy security that we're going to need going forward? Because if anything we've learned from this Middle Eastern war is that regional energy security is the way forward. It is much more important. And Latin America has minerals, as I can show you here. Latin America has oil and gas, and we have the people and the know-how. So how do we put them together? So I'm going to finish with that, setting us all up. There are a lot of questions that I think we'll get a chance to get to here. One I kicked off here was, will Latin America embrace the Monroe Doctrine? Or is this another imperialistic movement? What sort of things can Latin America do to keep from having these cycles always hitting it when we look at the economies? The third thing on a more longer term is, how do we sustain growth? How do we do that as some of these giant deposits of oil and gas, particularly things like pre-salt, start to wind down? How do we replace those? Is it going to be minerals, or is there going to be something else? And then electrification. Everybody's trying to electrify everything right now. Is that a good thing for Latin America? Or is that a bad thing? When you think about the data centers and you think about all the connectivity, is moving too fast right now, or are we going at the right pace? And then the last 2 things that are out there that we have a chance to talk about, one is, what's going to happen to Venezuela post-Trump? A lot of questions. A lot of people, I think, are waiting on the sidelines to see the answer to that. And then Cuba. So with that, I'll sit down, and hopefully I teed up some good discussion here for the group. And Carlos, over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you so much, Bob. That excellent background, and we'll keep those questions in mind. The dynamics is anybody can pick up the glove and answer, and anybody can chime in. You don't feel the imposition to answer all the questions, but whatever you want to answer. And let's start going back to the Don't Row doctrine. Now, the U.S. in 2025-26 modified radically its geopolitical, energy, and trade stances, and it affects the perception of the U.S. of Latin America. First, it's paying attention, but then we are kind of the backyard again. How are they affecting energy politics in Latin America and the Caribbean? Roberto.
Well, thank you, Carlos, and thank you, ARPEL, for inviting us to be part of this distinguished panel. Before going into the Latin American dimension, I would like to very briefly build upon the broader picture that Dan Yergin gave us before. The Third Gulf War is today into its 94th day. There was open fighting for 39 days, and since then we are in limbo. As Dan very well said, we don't know how this is going to end, and this, of course, is creating a lot of uncertainty. 91 years ago, the Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger invented a beautiful experiment with a cat that was at times alive, at times dead, and it seems rather appropriate to label this Middle East conflict that we're going through today as a new Schrödinger paradox, because we have the Hormuz Strait open or closed, we have a peace agreement or we don't. So I think it is worthy to make that introductory remark. Going into Latin America and the impact of the US policies that Carlos mentioned, in broader terms, I would say the impact is the same as what was received by the rest of the world, which I would summarize in two key words: volatility and uncertainty. However, as Dan Yergin also mentioned before, and Bob mentioned in his introductory presentation, this is a time of opportunity for Latin America, for business opportunities in oil and gas. Bob mentioned this striking figure of 6.1 million barrels per day of increase year on year between May last year and May this year. And Dan mentioned the need of European and Asian importers to diversify their sourcing. And this means concretely that Brazil, Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad, Argentina, and Venezuela, if it manages to sort of reconstruct the infrastructure that was destroyed in the past, will have better business opportunities.
Carlos, I'll jump in because I think I want to build upon some of what Bob laid out with the national security strategy. And, you know, in terms of U.S. Latin American relations, forever over the last couple decades, we've talked about the benign neglect, right? I can't remember how many times there would be, you know, discussions. People say, why isn't the U.S. doing more? Why isn't the U.S. putting more money on the table, putting more into the relationship? Why is the U.S. so focused on the Middle East or other parts of the world? So this idea of benign neglect really took hold for, pretty much since the proxy wars of the 80s, right? And I think the fact is the national security strategy takes the idea of benign neglect, puts it through the shredder, burns it, gets rid of it. And you really have now, as part of this America First, the U.S. preeminence. And so everything goes through that lens. So benign neglect now becomes, we are in charge, we are going to call the shots. And nowhere is this more important than when it comes to drugs and immigration and obviously natural resources. And so part of what the national security strategy and why I think it's so important that Bob highlighted it and why I'm underscoring some of these key tenets is because it really does give you the absolute guide to how they want to, they being this administration in my country, want to manage the globe in terms of relations, but we're focused on Latin America, right? And so the idea of preventing hostile foreign ownership of key assets, the idea of deeming how to manage critical supply chain and supply sources, natural resource management, and these kinds of things, right? And so then you add to that a corollary that came before the national security strategy, or something that was put forward in the campaign and on day one signed as an executive order, national energy dominance. Grouping together a whole of government approach to make the United States energy industry the world's leader. And so this idea of energy dominance is hugely important. So if you bookend energy dominance with the national security strategy, you start to see the sort of how it plays out in the region. And of course, I don't have to take you to where I'm going. The obvious next step is Venezuela. Enormous amount of oil. And in my opinion, the oil is what convinced Trump to take the bold action he did. Yes, there's drug interdiction, there's a whole lot of security reasons, but it was, as he said over 30 times in his January 4th press conference, oil, oil, oil. And I think that was a huge part of this strategy, building upon the national energy dominance. And you look at the visits by the U.S. officials, the Interior Secretary, the Secretary of Energy, National Energy. They see now Venezuela in some ways as a close associate of the U.S. energy dominance strategy, right? And again, this tracks back to the U.S. administration dictating what resources, in this case oil, are managed, who manages it, how it's managed, and basically calls the terms. I think those are things that are important to mention as we get into this sort of what's the national security strategy. And again, I think why it's so relevant is it really does give you the insight into what they're doing. And the final point I'd make on that is the removal of Nicolas Maduro, I would argue, has a direct connection to what happened in Iran. The boldness, the success, however you feel about it, the success of what transpired since January 3rd in Venezuela made a lot of folks in the foreign affairs or the National Security Administration in the White House feel that when Bibi Netanyahu came and said we could take out the leadership of Iran, I don't need to fill in the rest, do I?
Venezuela holds quite significant oil and gas resources. I think they overbook their what they call proved reserves, but let's call 2/3 at least of the region of conventional resources, by conventional and the faja. No? It is now under a peculiar Chavismo-Trumpismo hybrid governance, which I think is unprecedented. But the hydrocarbon law has been revamped quite positively for our sector. Is this enough to attract the needed investments? Let's say to bring it back to to 2 million.
So
what is missing?
a couple of things that what I mentioned earlier too is that there's an enigma here that all these years that this is the place in the world that has the largest resources, but it's not even close to producing as much as the Eagle Ford is or the Vaca Muerta. And if you look at gas, so there's 300 billion barrels of oil. There's over 200 trillion cubic feet of gas, yet it doesn't produce and never has produced anything close to that. So are we missing something here, or is there a great opportunity? We all went in there. I was part of the groups that went in there in the 90s, and that didn't bring production up very much either. So why do we think this time it's going to be different? If you look at that 200 trillion cubic feet of gas, that's the same size as the Haynesville in the United States. The Haynesville right now is producing 3 times what it is in Venezuela. And as I said, if you look at the Permian, I mean, you can look anywhere else in the region here, and it's not even close. Venezuela is moving from where it was in almost last place as an attractiveness as we look at things on a above ground risk. It's moving more towards the middle, but it's nowhere as competitive as most of the rest of Latin America. I think that's what has to happen for people to come in with big money. The other thing that has to happen is people have to believe that post-Trump, things won't revert. And I don't think anybody knows that answer.
Yeah, and if I can interject something very briefly. In Venezuela today, we have a problem of revamping production, but also rebuilding infrastructure. Some of you may be aware that during the Chavez and Maduro times, some pipelines were dismantled and sold as scrap. So there is quite a few places where you have to rebuild the infrastructure, and there are estimates that to take the current production of 900,000 barrels per day that Venezuela has, and is pretty similar to the one of Argentina, to $1.5 billion, you need approximately 1.5 million barrels per day, sorry. You need approximately $40 billion of investment in a very short period of time. If you look longer term, to go to 3 million barrels per day, the peak of Venezuela in the 70s was 3.8, you would need $140 billion of investment in production and infrastructure. So a huge challenge. And if you look at the case of Guyana that Dan was mentioning before, they discovered oil 10 years ago, started producing 7 years ago, and are already producing 1 million barrels per day in the same neighborhood, if you allow the expression. But maybe Jeremy, who knows Venezuela very well, can add something to that.
No, I mean, I think you guys are absolutely correct, and I want to come back to something Daniel Yergin said, but first, I think what we don't recognize enough, and most of us in the room get fascinated by oil in Venezuela, because of their abundance of oil, we just keep liking to obsess over the oil. But right now, I think one of the fundamental challenges, there's several, in Venezuela is the electric sector. The electric sector, talking about socioeconomics, talking about managing a sustainable development for the economy, this transition plan that the Trump administration talks a lot about. The electric sector, as we all know about overall the infrastructure, the sort of the degradation of the electric sector. I heard an anecdote in January that there was 32 gas turbines that were installed and only 4 were operating. Now, part of that was sanctions, that they couldn't get parts, and there's a whole panoply of challenges that have evolved over the. But I would actually like us to think a little bit about the electric sector. Number one, because it's so crucial to making any kinds of major production gains over the next couple of years, but also because I think it's crucial for the stability aspect that we hear about as part of this 3-part plan that the Trump administration touts. Without a improved electricity sector, and I'm not just talking for the oil and gas, I'm talking about for the country, I think there's going to be major challenges. And I would point to probably development banks as having to, and I think they're willing and able to play a huge role in that, because the ability to pay a tariff for electricity in Venezuela right now, yes, there's gas you can use for power generation, but the money for gas is going to come from exports, right? Whether it's via Trinidad, perhaps Colombia. The ability to reboot the electricity sector, I would like to flag as something that maybe doesn't get enough attention, but really perhaps is increasingly a linchpin for the entire stability question.
Now, going back to another country.
Sorry, one thing.
Yes, Steve.
Just a little bit about the electricity, though. You're spot on in that sense. So the only city with reliable power is Caracas.
Yeah.
Everyone else is almost non-existent. But the question to me is, who will pay for it?
Yeah.
And so trying to get some private investment.
What's the model?
Maybe there's some investors in here who will go for it, but I think it's going to be difficult to get the private investors because people can't pay for it.
That's right.
So how do you work that deal? It's almost like if you remember back in the 90s when everybody came to Latin America from the United States because of things were divested, you got deregulated. And they all came down here and they were into the favelas and into the slums and thought they were going to make all this extra money, and they discovered those people don't have any money to pay. So it's all over again. The story's back once again.
Well, free electricity is de facto social policy,
Right.
Now let's move. The Institute of the Americas is very close geographically and also on subject matter to Mexico, another important country that's kind of complicated for us, for our industry. Under López Obrador, they walked back all progress made by the Reforma and that attracted a lot of investment. But in past April, President Sheinbaum allowed fracking. So are there or might there be other significant changes, favorable changes for the industry in Mexico?
You know, we've seen this story once before. They drilled a lot of pilot wells. There's some very encouraging things if you look at the Jurassic, not the continuation of the Eagle Ford, but actually some other reservoirs that look interesting. But to start from scratch, to get going again, where would you put your money? Here in Argentina or in Mexico? To me, it's back to your first question almost, is if I had $1, where would I go? And it's not just Mexico. Colombia is also thinking about it again. So here we go again.
Yeah, look, the change from the Peña Nieto government to the López Obrador government obviously is one of those oscillations in political ideology that had a direct translation into energy policy. It basically froze, in many ways walked back, or certainly froze the reform, the major opening that happened in 2013 and 2014. I would point to that question around fracking. It got a lot of attention because Sheinbaum, obviously somebody who has a PhD and has been a very well-known person who's a scientist and a supporter of climate change efforts. I would point that decision or announcement, because it really is not a whole lot, a little bit much ado about nothing, but is derivative of Mexico's enormous dependency on imports of natural gas from the United States. So what we've seen over the last couple of years obviously accelerated when the Trump administration came back and the negotiations, the review of the USMCA trade agreement began again, and leverage points. Mexico gets something like 75% of its natural gas from pipeline imports of the United States, and then something like 65% of its power generation is from natural gas in Mexico. So there becomes a huge, energy security is national security question that I think now has driven folks to, again, want to look at the domestic opportunities. But the final thing I would say on that is Pemex continues to be, and will probably be for the foreseeable future, a complete, I think diplomatically how to put this, disaster, mess. It is something that no Mexican government has been able to figure out how to manage. So the idea that now Pemex in charge, because this government is clearly, the government will lead any projects or developments or contracts. The idea that Pemex will be able to manage as a majority developer of any kinds of fracking or shale projects is hard to see given its current status.
Okay, now let's move to the major producer. And paraphrasing Yates again, the center cannot hold. Brazil will have a presidential election in October, and there seems to be poll parity in a potential runoff between Lula, seeking a fourth term, and Flavio Bolsonaro, apparently seeking to avenge his ex-president father. While Lula supports continuous oil and gas E&P, he also favors renewable energy and socio-environmental protection. Bolsonaro seems to favor fossil fuels and deregulation, but both support oil and gas expansion. So beyond political polarization, is there an implicit policy of state in Brazil regarding oil and gas?
Well, I would like to jump in there by saying that probably Brazil's greatest asset has been to have rule of law compliance as a state policy. Some Brazilian friends here in the audience might point to nuances, but when you compare Brazil to many other Latin American countries, there is obviously a big advantage, and I would like to make my case by mentioning a few figures and comparing 3 years and 3 countries. 1970, 1998, when Hugo Chavez rose to power in Venezuela, and 2025. And the 3 countries would be Brazil, of course, Venezuela, and Argentina, the host country of this event. In 1970, Brazil was producing 200,000 barrels per day. Argentina was producing 400,000 and Venezuela 3.8 million barrels per day. 1998, with Chavez starting his government, Venezuela was still at 3.5 million barrels per day. Brazil had risen to 1 million, and Argentina was in the range of 800,000, but had certain fluctuations. 2025, Brazil, as Carlos mentioned in the opening, is now producing 4.3 million barrels per day. Venezuela is down to 900,000 barrels per day, and Argentina is producing the same level after having dropped to 500,000 barrels per day in 2016. What is the common thread? Rule of law, respect. Brazil respected rule of law. Argentina did at times, and therefore fluctuated, and Venezuela decided to move away from it and is now struggling to come back.
Just to build on that, so we're in a business that's all about profits and dividends and cash flow these days, right? And it's extremely quick to move to where you can make the best of that. And you can go down the list, whether it's Venezuela or Bolivia. There's another one that we can see exactly what happened when they changed everything and nationalized things, right? Hadn't been no investment. They're running out of natural gas. They've had to reverse the pipeline to try to bring gas now they're becoming a transit state rather than a producer. So the capital discipline is extremely important in the region. Brazil, though, has another thing besides the rule of law that Roberto brings up that's very admirable too. That's one of the poster childs in the business, which is the way that they conduct bid rounds, the way that they're transparent, and also that they're very predictable. They have a very long-term plan that they put out there, and that's become a model throughout the industry and particularly in the region. There are a couple of other countries in the region too that are doing something similar. But right now there are 40 countries trying to attract investors. And it's not a secret where money's going to go. It's going to follow exactly that. If I can make a profit and I can ensure that it's going to be somewhat protected.
This point of certainty, Daniel Yergin obviously underscored that, I think, with the famous above ground, below ground we always talk about. But Roberto Ardengui, correct me if I'm wrong, but even with the rewriting of contracts of the pre-salt, and when the pre-salt was the winning lottery ticket, some auctions were halted. There were some changes, but correct me if I'm wrong, there was never a revised or rewritten contract. So every contract that was in place was honored going forward. New terms were adopted. There was a new law. There was the whole production sharing, all of those kinds of things. But I think that's nuance that's very important, right? And we all are nodding in agreement here because that's a hugely important point to hey, we're competing with 40 countries. Yeah, we've changed our laws at one point, but we honored every contract that had been signed up to those changes. And then people competed and participated in the market based upon the new laws and all that. And I think there's one really clear example of how Brazil has honored contracts and had a national strategy. And that's last year was the 50th anniversary of the national ethanol policy, which, believe it or not, came out of the 1970s Middle East oil supply crisis, right? So when they were only producing a couple 100,000 barrels a day, they really faced that oil shock. And I think the national ethanol strategy, pro-alcohol as it's known, is another great example of how Brazil, across military government to left-wing government, just across all kinds of government, has maintained a consistent policy in the broader sense.
Now, let's go to a historical contrast to Brazil, to Brazil giving the perception of stability and respect of contracts. And let's go to Argentina and visit the past a little bit. Today, Argentina's Milei government has enthusiastically and unconditionally aligned itself with the Trump administration, which reciprocated by coming financially to its aid at a critical electoral moment. The IMF also underwrites its economic program. and Argentina can boast the extent and quality of its vaca muerta, and has rolled out a RIGI, policy of incentives and guarantees, a red carpet to oil and gas investors. But given its structural economic weakness and history of debt defaults, its country risk premium is still about double those of Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. So the tough questions for you, because you're in Argentina now. Will Argentina attract enough capital to fully develop Vaca Muerta to its potential? The conjuncture looks brilliant, but what could also be missing in the perception of long-term governability and institutional quality?
Well, I guess I have to
You're the local, yeah.
start with the first shot. I will try to answer that in two dimensions. First, on the macroeconomic side, as you raised, Carlos, and then in terms of what the oil and gas industry is contributing to the future of the country. The country risk, as you well pointed out, remains high, approximately 500 basis points, doubling the level of most of the Latin American neighbors. But it should be highlighted that during the issuance of recent oil and gas company corporate bonds, the implicit country risk, or risk premium is the better expression of those bonds, was half of the sovereign risk. So, I mean, one can conclude the Republic of Vaca Muerta ranks better than the Republic of Argentina, okay? The other thing, you mentioned FDI. Foreign direct investment is indeed the lowest in Latin America. We rank very poorly there. And it's a result of what you mentioned before, our poor track record, 9 debt defaults. They are fresh in the memory of the international investor community. So the answer is very clear-cut. We need to improve our institutional quality, to take your expression, and preserve macroeconomic and fiscal order for at least 2 to 3 presidential terms, ideally with changes at the helm to acquire some longer-term credibility. Now, going to oil and gas and its contribution. In 2025, Argentina had an energy trade surplus of $7.8 billion against a $7 billion deficit that we showed only in 2013, only 12 years earlier. And we expect to reach some $10 or $11 billion surplus at the end of the year. At the current level of exports, every $10 per barrel that the prices increase add $1.1 billion in revenue of oil and gas exports. So the prospects are good. I'm sure Horacio Marin in the following panel will give a vision of how this can evolve longer term. We are quite optimistic about this. And one final comment I would like to interject is Dan Jürgen, answering one of your questions, Carlos, made reference to the United Arab Emirates exit from OPEC. And perhaps some people know in the audience, but not everybody, that Argentina was invited 4 times to join OPEC Plus in the last 3 administrations. It systematically declined because if we were to subordinate the large-scale development of Vaca Muerta to a quota system, it would be the end of Vaca Muerta. It was not easy to convince some politicians because they saw themselves in the jet set of the international press immediately and were very tempted of being photographed with sheikhs and other leaders worldwide. But we held this decision. And when you mentioned before that Brazil is today an observer and in OPEC Plus, and Dan mentioned that he doubted that they would change status. I think Brazil followed the same logic. I mean, joining a quota system club will sort of limit the development that you can aspire to.
Yes.
So building a little bit on what Roberto said, RIGI is a fantastic program that, there are lots of big projects that are being announced. And of course, we have the LNG projects, which are going forward, which are huge amounts of money. So those will for sure start to build the credibility that's needed to raise the ratings and things for Argentina. But one thing that, to change a little bit, to go back to, it's really about the rocks, isn't it? And the Vaca Muerta rocks are some of the best in the world when we think of that basin and what it still has to give. And it is starting to attract the attention, again, of the U.S. independents, right? If we have Continental Oil is down here, and there are others for sure looking. So when you think about continuing the story of Vaca Muerta, it looks bright at the moment, but you've got to do like most things that we've been talking about. The facilities now have to catch up with the production, and that will take a lot of the investment, which is what the RIGI is moving forward on. So it's moving in the right direction, and it looks pretty promising.
How many Argentines are in the audience, by the way? I always love this one word that gets used very often here, quilombo. So how do we escape quilombo? But moving beyond, I mean, for me, I don't know if I really ever fully understood, because it gets used in all these permutations, But joking aside, or maybe not, I remember several years ago when Vaca Muerta was starting to emerge, the famous YPF deal with Chevron, and things were really starting to appear on the move. And many of the presentations or discussions at that time, and the Institute convened several different roundtables and discussions. I'm sure many of you in the room were at those. The one thing I just crystal clear was always the only way Vaca Muerta will be fully monetized is by LNG. And Argentina, to monetize Vaca Muerta, has to develop LNG export capabilities. And here we are in 2026, as far as I understand, about a year out from the first commercial operation of Southern Energy, with the deal signed with a German off-taker, which brings us back to another point I'd like to emphasize. This transatlantic opportunity between exporting from the Atlantic basin of Latin America to Europe, whether it's LNG or oil, is a major, major opportunity. But back to the point about Vaca Muerta, and obviously we'll hear about YPF has a project as well to move into the global LNG marketplace. So I think we see tremendous advances. And the final other thing I'll say is, going back to this comparative analysis, is you mentioned that Colombia may come back and look at fracking again if the Tiger wins, El Tigre is successful, and I think that's correct. And I remember people in Colombia pointing to the timeline of development of Vaca Muerta and overlaying the timeline of underdevelopment or lack of development in Colombia, and saying, look at what Argentina's done with Vaca Muerta and their shale resource. Admitted to me, maybe a little bit of apples and oranges in terms of the base, but still, I think the point is, it's about the policies, and now we see RIGI that's going to accelerate this. Argentina moves into the global LNG space by way of at least one or two projects. Vaca Muerta is being monetized, and it has a huge impact on the trade balance of the nation. It hopefully will have a huge impact at the lower levels, because I think that's still the way you need to try and solve the quilombo, is the man on the street needs to feel the benefits, needs to feel that Vaca Muerta, the Uber driver doesn't just hear about Vaca Muerta as this panacea, but actually feels that there's opportunity and economic development being derived from this major development.
And if I can add a minor point that is applicable to Argentina, but to many Latin American countries, and tied to the opportunity window that we mentioned before in the panel. Historically, we were penalized by legal uncertainty. The Third Gulf War has created a problem for the Persian Gulf countries,
Yeah.
which one could label as a logistical uncertainty. So the Persian Gulf logistical uncertainty is driving many importers to look at Latin America in general and Argentina in particular to a safer source of oil and gas.
Carlos, you mentioned it. There's no choke point on the Atlantic basin of Latin America. Guyana, Venezuela, just go down the Atlantic coast, Brazil, Suriname, just keep going down. All those countries have direct transatlantic routes that don't have a Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Panama Canal is obviously, we're talking a Pacific basin, but Atlantic basin, there are no choke points. And we have a zone of peace. The region is a peaceful, generally stable region, democracies in place.
Kind of.
We could debate a little bit, but
Well, now to talking about the center not holding, we just had an election in Colombia. We're just going to go into a very polarized runoff between two extremes. And something similar is happening in Peru, which is going to the runoff next Sunday. So you three have to get out your crystal balls and predict what's going to happen for the industry in Peru and in Colombia.
I think I showed the map earlier that we're turning blue, as we would say, on one side or in red, right? So we're going blue in this sense. We used different colors than we do in the U.S. for Latin America, but Peru and many of the governments in Latin America are at a pivotal point. Not so much for the political parties themselves, but it's back to the old problem of how do we raise people out of poverty? How do we provide them energy, power, all those sorts of things? So the candidates that are going to promise and can deliver are the ones that are going to move forward.
the only thing I'll say about Peru is I think there was a point where the president's approval rating was lower than the average GDP growth of the country per year. I think the president's approval was 3 or 4% and GDP was 6, 7, maybe growth rate. I mean, that can tell you a lot of things, and you hear a lot of people pointing to the stability of the monetary system and the central bank as being one of the ways that has continued to insulate the investment climate and the economic development from the just political disaster that's been the case for years there. But
to your point on this sort of heterodox situation of having macroeconomic growth and stability while having political turbulence in Peru, the secret has been Velarde, the president of the Central Bank of Peru, which has been reelected throughout, I think it's 35 years now. And one of the big challenges is one of the candidates wants to keep him, the other wants to oust him. Yeah. And in terms of Colombia, to point out paradoxes, well, they had a president that is called Petro, but did not really like oil as a source of energy.
The one thing I would add here is, this sort of idea of a left-right and the swinging pendulum. I think part of what we've also seen is, in the U.S. we have this saying, when you don't like who's in power, throw the bums out. And it's translated mostly as like an anti-incumbency, right? And so I think we're still seeing, it does manifest a little bit in a left-right kind of swing, but I think we're still going through this, what can best be described as anti-incumbency. And so, people were not terribly happy with the job Petro did. And then, of course, Petro was elected because people weren't terribly happy with Duque. So, I think we still have a bit of anti-incumbency that's percolating. And I would bring that to the table here in Argentina as the election happens next year. I'm super curious the next few days. I talk to different people. It's a long way out, but I'm pretty sure at this point in the 2023 electoral cycle, no one knew who Javier Milei was. Well, okay, a few people did. But Javier Milei was probably polling in single digits at this point in the electoral cycle of 2023, if I have my years correct. So my only point is I'm not suggesting anything other than I still personally and sort of anecdotally believe that there is a strong anti-incumbency that, other than Mexico, has been the case just about in every major country.
But it does not go back to whether you're delivering or not?
Yeah.
Peru was once, back to your point, Roberto, Peru was one of the fastest growing economies forever, right? And Colombia was not far behind, but those two both have suffered because of policies and mismanagement in some sense of how to take advantage of their opportunities.
Voters are not getting less impatient. I mean, I think we're actually getting more and more, we're more impatient. We just don't want to, we don't want to give 2 or 3 administrations to see the structural adjustments.
Well, so for the last question, and very briefly, to catch up with on time, we won't be picking on countries, but talking in general. For example, in the US, the digital economy is expanding at a record speed, and with it, energy demand for data centers, which is significant now as part of the energy demand in the US. Now, we have energy in Latin America. We have lots of energy to offer. Are they going to mushroom in our region too, and where? Which countries do you think are going to lead?
I think Argentina is an obvious one, for sure, that has the energy, as you say. It has the institutions that are here. It also has a lot of high-tech businesses already here. I think Chile is another one that'll probably, so the Southern Cone, I would say, stands a good point to being one of the nucleuses. Brazil, of course, is in there. So it'll be the bigger economies, to be honest, that'll take advantage of it, in our opinion, first. There may be some surprises, but I don't know. What do you gentlemen think?
Yeah, I mean, Chile, I think it's certainly because of the sort of fiber and the sort of advance of the decarbonization of its grid, which had been important for a lot of the consumers of for the cloud and data centers. Mexico as well. I mean, you have the proximity to the U.S., you have the trade agreement, at least as of now. I think Mexico is another one, for sure. Brazil, Chile. I mean, of course, any country that has the ability to deliver reliable, affordable energy. I would say sustainable, but I think that piece is falling off a little bit. I think it's not just, can you get me sustainable energy, it's can you just get me energy? And I want it to be reliable and hopefully 24/7, 365. And by the way, if it's not too costly, that's a premium as well. So I think these are the kinds of things that are happening. I would just add the final piece on this data center or the intersections of data centers and energy, because it's something we've been convening a lot of events at the Institute about. And I think we again see the famous social license to operate that we're all so familiar with in the natural resource industry. It is becoming a major flashpoint in communities when they hear data center, when they hear there's going to be a data center built. So I think this is something all of us in the sector need to be aware of. I mean, we are in a certain degree, but I think the flashpoint, and we're seeing it already in the political cycle in the United States, it is becoming a major, major issue.
Just to add very briefly on Argentina, as Bob pointed out, we have several initiatives and projects in Patagonia, in Neuquén, in Chubut. There's one big one in Bahía Blanca in the province of Buenos Aires. Where we are behind with regard to Chile or Brazil is in the regulatory framework. Chile and Brazil are doing quite a lot in trying to develop regulatory frameworks for AI. Argentina has not quite started there. And the other thing I would like to say on a more general term, and given that this is an oil and gas conference, is that when the AI revolution started, some people tried to make us believe that AI could only be done with nuclear or renewables. Reality has proven that gas is a very good option for data centers, and many hyperscalers are now turning to gas because of economic reasons. So what is important, and energy transition historically has been about that, is innovation and competition go together. So let us decide in terms of pricing, and I think gas is pretty competitive there.
Okay, I could stay here chatting with you for hours, and it's been very interesting, and I think it's a luxury for us and for the audience, the insights that we heard from Daniel and from you gentlemen, and I think the audience shares with me that appreciation with a round of applause.